Some of the churches that Paul established were in a Roman province called Galatia, and the fruit of the Spirit is one of the many things talked about in this letter he wrote to that group of churches. And Paul laid the foundation for at least a dozen known churches, maybe as many as 20. And in the process, Paul learned what Moses had learned centuries earlier, leading those lovable and delightful children of Israel. It was a lot of work. You couldn't just plant a church and walk away like some sort of a spiritual Johnny Appleseed. First century churches, like churches today, were often an uphill battle to maintain. They were like gardens where the weeds often outnumbered the plants you were trying to raise intentionally. Churches took constant time and attention to become what they needed to be. Paul's been called the hardest working man in the New Testament, and it was a well-deserved title. He made 4 missionary journeys, covering about 9,000 miles on foot and several thousand on ships. And all this before 4-lane highways and rest stops and Super 8 motels. And a good deal of his second and third missionary journeys were consumed with straightening out this, that, or the other problem with churches he'd already established on his first journey. And if a church can be likened to a garden full of weeds, the weed that was the most predominant issue was the law versus grace. Now, Paul himself took to grace like an eagle to the sky, and it seems like he left the law behind, law that he'd been devoted to all of his life, left it behind without a second thought. Paul believed the grace of Christ was sufficient for the believer, period. Now, others had some difficulty with this transition. The church in Galatia had been infiltrated by a group called the Judaizers, who were teaching that to be a Christian, one was responsible for the entirety of the Jewish law, all the ceremonial, all the dietary, plus circumcision. So Paul reminded them that they were under grace, but not only that their new relationship with God wasn't a matter of following rules, but in their new faith, they were a new creation. They had a role to play in this newness of life. They had opportunities to reflect God's character, to understand Him in a whole new way, and to be understood by Him. Paul explained to them that their closeness to God and the new life they offered them would be an act of creation. Spiritual truths don't always translate into human language. So as Jesus had before him, Paul turned to metaphor. And the metaphor he chose was fruit, and how fruit grew on the vine or tree. You explain the unexplainable by comparing it to something your audience, whether they're listening or reading, already knew. And they had all witnessed the growth of fruit. And what they knew about fruit was that at one point it didn't exist, and then later it did. If they were farmers, they understood that they sowed seed in the ground, and later wheat or barley appeared. It was a common occurrence. They had seen it hundreds of times. And yet, it was a mystery. More than a mystery, a miracle. And just as fruit appeared on the vine or tree with enough rain, the spiritual fruit would appear in the lives of people who were close to God. In the natural world of trees and vines, fruit was proof of life, proof that the host plant was healthy and vibrant. In the spiritual realm, the same thing is true. The fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, faithfulness, and kindness, and gentleness, were the fruit that would easily and freely bear if we are connected to God. The spiritual fruit are as dependent on that connection as the natural fruit is on good soil and rain. Now, I've listed 7 fruit, leaving 1 out. Self-control. It seems a little different than the others, and so it is. It helps us master the first 7. There are other lists, though. One appears in the nearby book of Galatians, who were struggling with similar issues. Dependence on rules rather than grace. Paul used a different metaphor here. Clothing, something you wore. Putting on the new nature as you might an outfit. The list is not identical, being compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience. Paul advises the Colossians to be tolerant of others and forgiving. And love, especially love. Paul was making the same point both times. Religion was expressed by obeying rules, but their new faith was expressed differently. Formerly they had things to do, but now they had a people to be. We are a people that believes in redemption. What we were is not as important as what we are becoming. Love is at the beginning of the list in Galatians, the last quality named in Colossians. The language Paul chose to illustrate these truths is telling. In both Greek and English, the word fruit has a double meaning. One literal, grapes, oranges, and bananas, and a second meaning, a figurative one, where fruit is used to mean the product of an action. A man builds a house, that is the fruit of his labor. If a tree is to bear fruit, it must be a healthy tree to begin with. Planted in good, fertile soil. Rain certainly helps the process, but it is a process. Time is involved. Of course, the same thing is true of human beings and figurative fruit. Bearing spiritual fruit indicates spiritual health. That we are as connected to God as the fruit is to the tree. The metaphor Paul chose is pitch perfect for the application because it tells us that time is an indispensable element in this process. Natural fruit takes time to mature and ripen. So does the figurative version, spiritual fruit. Either kind of fruit is ready and useful in its time. Does being impatient with the tree or vine produce figs or pomegranates faster? It was the Apostle John with his brother James who wanted to call fire down on the Samaritan village because it didn't show the proper respect to Jesus. It was also James and John who wanted to sit at the left and right hand of Jesus in heaven, egged on by their mother, it seems. But that nature's an impulsive young man, which caused Jesus to nickname them sons of thunder, was superseded by the passage of time, which told a fuller story. James was the first to possibly martyred for his faith, and his brother John went on to grow into a wise elder statesman for the faith. That's evidence that transformation takes time, and that Jesus allowed for that. Now, maybe Jesus could have snapped his fingers and made them become what they were going to be instantly, but he didn't. The sad truth is that we humans learn a lot from our mistakes, and I know one particular human who's given plenty of time to learn from the school of life. The books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes were written by one man, Solomon, who had everything, Proverbs, made many mistakes in life, and lost it all, Ecclesiastes. And there was wisdom to be found in both states. So next time we're going to start with the first fruit listed in Galatians, love, and we work our way down the list in successive weeks. This was just an introduction to the fruit of the Spirit, but I think important to get to the lay of the land, see some context. If you found something you thought was useful here, please subscribe so it'll be easy to find next time. Thank you for watching and listening.